The night was quiet until the sound of missiles broke through the darkness. Fire streaked across the sky, and within seconds the ground shook with violent force. Russia's strike tore through Ukraine's railway hub, the massive system that kept soldiers supplied, civilians moving, and food reaching markets. Metal screamed as tracks bent and broke. Freight cars were ripped from their places, and the control buildings collapsed into heaps of stone and fire. Flames rose high into the sky, while smoke spread so thick it turned morning into shadow. Witnesses said the earth felt like it had split in two. For those standing near, there was no time to think, only to run, to drag the wounded out of burning wreckage, to scream the names of loved ones swallowed in the chaos. It was not an accident, and it was not random. This was calculated destruction, aimed directly at Ukraine's lifeline. The railway hub was not only steel and machines, it was the circulation system that carried a nation's hope. Soldiers at the front relied on it for reinforcements, families depended on it to escape advancing battles. Farmers used it to send grain that kept bread on tables across the world. In one strike, all of that froze in place. Schedules dissolved. Journeys ended before they could begin. People who had believed they still had time suddenly realized the path out was gone. The silence after the explosions was not commit, was suffocating. It was the silence of a lifeline cut. Analysts watching the strike unfold knew immediately what it meant. Russia had chosen to choke Ukraine's survival, to paralyze its ability to move men and materials, to carve fear into every soldier and every citizen. Experts said the damage would not only slow the war effort, it would stretch into the daily lives of ordinary Ukrainians. What looked like twisted tracks and shattered locomotives was, in truth, a broken artery, bleeding into every corner of the country. For the men and women waiting on trains that would never arrive, the attack was not just on a structure, it was on their future. The devastation grew clearer with every passing hour. Grain shipments sat stalled, their cargo destined to rot, while markets abroad braced for shortages. Fuel that should have reached armored vehicles and trucks was locked behind ruined rails. Ammunition needed at the front line was delayed at the exact moment when timing mattered most. For civilians, the collapse was felt in the rising price of food, in the empty shelves of pharmacies, in the halted journeys that left families stranded in vulnerable towns. The hub had been a bridge between civilian survival and military strength, and with its collapse, both sides of that bridge gave way. Russia's missiles did more than destroy a target. They struck directly at Ukraine's heartbeat, sending shockwaves across Europe and beyond. Leaders in neighboring countries warned of the global consequences, while Ukraine scrambled to create alternate routes. Trucks began hauling supplies where trains once ran, but the process was slower, heavier, less certain. Each delay meant a soldier without ammunition, a family without medicine, a village left waiting in fear. The hub was more than infrastructure, it was momentum itself, and momentum, once lost, is hard to recover. The smoke may clear, the flames may die down, but the silence of halted trains will echo as long as the nation struggles to move forward under the shadow of war. In the shadows of the destruction, questions began to rise. How had Russia managed to strike with such precision? Who had fed them the information? Intelligence networks, satellites, spies on the ground. Each possibility carried the weight of betrayal or failure. Western analysts debated whether Moscow had acted alone or whether the strike was part of a broader operation, carefully planned to test Ukraine's defenses and to expose the cracks in its coordination with its allies. The hub was not just a target of opportunity, it was a message wrapped in fire. By crippling the system at its core, Russia reminded the world that it could reach anywhere, at any time, with terrifying accuracy. Whispers began to spread that surveillance satellites had missed key signals, or that warnings had been drowned out in the constant flow of battlefield alerts. Some claimed Russia had tapped into electronic communications, reading movements like an open book. Others suggested that sleeper agents inside Ukraine may have marked the target long before the missiles were fired. The strike was not only a military blow but also a psychological one, shaking confidence in the intelligence systems that were supposed to shield Ukraine from surprise. The thought that secrets could have leaked to the enemy cut deep, and suspicion began to circle among ranks already stretched thin by exhaustion and fear. Behind closed doors, Western leaders weighed the danger. If Russia could isolate one hub with such devastating impact, what would stop it from repeating the same tactic against other lifelines? Was this strike a rehearsal for a larger offensive, or was it a warning shot meant to weaken morale? The shadow war stretched further than missiles. It reached into strategy rooms, supply depots, and the minds of every soldier waiting at the front. The silence after the attack carried more than the sound of absence. It carried doubt, and doubt was poison in a war that demanded unshakable resolve. While analysts searched for answers, life on the ground in Ukraine was unraveling. Soldiers stranded at forward positions began rationing supplies, counting bullets, and waiting for reinforcements that never arrived on time. In cities, families who had once trusted the railway as their way out now stared at wreckage and realized they were trapped. A mother with 2 children waiting on a platform watched as smoke rose where her train should have come, her eyes reflecting the dread of being caught in a tightening vice. Villagers who depended on the railway for food and medicine saw shelves empty and clinics run dry. What had once been the background hum of life, the steady rhythm of trains passing in the night, was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The psychological toll spread like wildfire. Fear became a constant companion. Every distant boom in the night made people wonder if the next target would be the station nearest to them. Farmers saw their grain piling up with no way to move it, their livelihood rotting before their eyes. Children asked when the trains would return, and parents gave no answers. The collapse of a hub was not just an interruption of movement, it was the theft of certainty. Communities once held together by the promise of mobility now faced isolation. And with isolation came despair. For the soldiers, the consequences were measured in hours lost, in positions weakened, in lives placed at risk. For civilians, they were measured in hunger, in fear, in the sound of sirens instead of engines. Ukraine was on the edge, not only of the battlefield but of endurance itself. The war was no longer something that passed through railway lines. It was carved into daily life, in every delay, every absence, every breath held when the sky turned dark and silent before the next wave of fire. The attack on the railway hub was more than a single strike, it was a turning point, a moment that altered the direction of the entire war. Ukraine had faced missile attacks before, but this one was different. This one targeted the arteries of survival, leaving the country gasping for breath. In the days that followed, the nation felt the weight of the blow. Supplies no longer moved. With speed, soldiers waited longer for reinforcements, and civilians faced shortages that grew heavier with every passing sunrise. The trains that once symbolized connection and escape had become twisted reminders of vulnerability. What once carried life now stood as ruins, silent testimonies to the precision of a strategy designed not just to destroy but to break resolve. Across the globe, leaders understood what had happened. In NATO headquarters, the strike was studied, frame by frame, analysts noting the precision, the timing, the intent. The conclusion was clear. Russia had chosen to send a message, not only to Ukraine but to the entire West. The attack showed that no matter how much support poured into Kyiv, the lifelines could be severed at will. It was a brutal demonstration that shifted the balance of psychological power. Suddenly, questions filled every discussion table. How could Ukraine fight a war if its supply chains were always in the crosshairs? How could Western nations promise stability when the very infrastructure was so fragile? The missiles had done more than strike steel. They had sown doubt, and doubt spread faster than fire. For Ukraine, the strike forced hard choices. Commanders had to divert resources to defend transport hubs, stretching already thin defenses. Engineers rushed to rebuild tracks while trucks carried loads once meant for trains. But the roads were slower, smaller, and more vulnerable. Every adjustment carried risk. Every delay cost lives. Yet even in the hardship, resilience began to surface. Communities formed networks to share food and medicine. Soldiers learned to ration and adapt, and families found ways to survive in the shadow of ruin. The hub may have been destroyed, but the will to endure remained unbroken. Still, no one could deny that the war had entered a new phase, one in which every movement carried greater danger and every victory demanded greater sacrifice. Beyond Ukraine, the world began to feel the ripple. Markets trembled as grain exports stalled. Nations dependent on Ukrainian food supplies braced for shortages, and pressure mounted on Western leaders to respond more aggressively. Debates raged about sending more air defenses, more weapons, more support, but behind the promises lingered an uneasy truth. Russia had proven it could change the rhythm of war with a